the England of the 1830s, a man could lose his work on a Monday and his family by Friday. Not to fever, to a building with a high wall where they took his clothes, cut his hair, and put him in a uniform worn by strangers. His wife was walked through a different door. He would not be permitted to speak to her again. Hundreds of them went up across England and Wales. The poor named them for the most hated prison in Europe. They called them the Bastilles. And none of it was punishment for a crime. So what was it for? What the families walking through that gate did not understand was that the misery inside was not a failure of the system. It was the design. Parliament had written it down. The rule was called less eligibility. Life inside had to be made worse than the life of the poorest laborer still scraping by outside, because if it were not worse, the reasoning went, the poor might choose it. This was the Victorian Workhouse, and for the better part of a century, it was the only thing standing between an English family and the street. The day began in the dark, with a bell. There was no clock in the ward that mattered, and no choice about the hour. The bell rang, and men rose from narrow beds set close together in a long, cold room. And the smell of that room is the first thing a modern visitor would notice, and the last thing they would forget. Unwashed bodies packed into a space with almost no ventilation, damp brick, the sharp animal reek of the tub at the end of the row that served as the ward's only night convenience. Over all of it, faintly, the carbolic they scrubbed the floors with, which never covered anything. They dressed in the uniform. They lined up. They were counted. Then they went to work, because work was the entire point. It is a mistake to imagine the workhouse as a shelter that happened to be grim. It was a test. The theory behind it was that poverty was, at bottom, a choice. That a man out of work was a man who had declined to find any. So the workhouse was built to make that choice unbearable. If you were truly desperate, you would accept its terms. If you were merely lazy, you would go and find a job rather than submit. The building itself was the interrogation, and so the work was chosen for its uselessness as much as its labor. Men picked oakum. They were handed lengths of old ship's rope, tarred and stiffened and salted by years at sea, and a blunt metal spike, and they were required to pick the rope apart into its original loose fibers. The tar had turned the strands to something closer to wire than string. The fibers cut. Fingers split at the tips and along the nails, and the tar drove into the splits. And the hands did not heal because the next morning the bell rang, and there was more rope. 9 hours of it, a daily weight to reach, and a punishment if you fell short. Others broke stones. They sat in a walled yard and swung a hammer at rock until the pieces were small enough to be pushed through an iron grate set into the wall. The grate was the measure. When the stone passed through, it was done, and there was more stone. And some of them crushed bones. Animal bones were carted in from knackers and butchers, and men stood over them with heavy iron rammers and pounded them into dust to be sold as fertilizer. It brought a small income to the house. Remember the bones. They matter later. At mid-morning, the bell rang again, and they ate. The word for the food was gruel, and gruel is oatmeal boiled thin in water, not porridge. Porridge implies a body to it. This was closer to gray water with a memory of grain, ladled into a bowl, with bread on the side and sometimes cheese. In many houses, it was eaten in silence because conversation at the table had been forbidden, and the only sounds in a hall of 200 people were spoons and swallowing and coughing. An English novelist put a boy in that hall in 1838 and had him stand up and ask for a second serving, and the scene was so quietly outrageous to its readers that nearly 200 years later, it is still the single thing most people know about the workhouse. Dickens did not invent the gruel. He was describing lunch. If you'd like to keep walking these old streets with me, subscribe. There's a new century every week. But the food was not the cruelest thing in the building, and neither was the rope. The cruelest thing was the architecture. The workhouse separated families on arrival, by law and by design. Men in one wing, women in another, boys in a third, girls in a fourth. A husband and wife who had been married 40 years were parted at the door and housed within 100 feet of one another for the rest of their lives, and might catch sight of each other across a yard on a Sunday and not be permitted to cross it. Young children could stay with their mothers. Then they reached the age of separation, and they were taken to the children's ward. And a woman who had entered the house with her family in her arms found herself alone in a room full of strangers, listening through a wall. That was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the deterrent working exactly as intended. And then there was Andover. In 1845, word began to reach London that something had gone wrong at the workhouse in the Hampshire town of Andover, where the master ran the house with a severity extreme, even by the standards of a system built on severity. The men there were crushing bones as men did in many houses. But the bones arriving at Andover were not clean. They came from knackers' yards with gristle and marrow still on them, and they had been sitting. The men were fighting over them. They were fighting for the scraps of rotten meat still clinging to the bone and for the marrow inside it. And they were eating it. Grown men on their knees in a yard gnawing at putrid horsebone in a building the state had constructed to keep them alive. It went to Parliament. There was an inquiry, and the inquiry was a scandal, and the scandal did what 100,000 quiet miseries had not. It forced a change. Bone crushing was ended. The commission that had overseen the entire system was dissolved and rebuilt. The workhouse itself was not abolished. It was merely embarrassed. The day ended the way it began, with a bell, in the dark, in the long, cold room. And for a great many of them, that was the shape of every day that remained. The old did not leave. The sick went to the infirmary ward at the back, and a good number of them died there. And the house buried its dead in a common grave with no stone and no name, because a stone cost money, and the point of the building was that they had none. Here is the part that unsettles me most. The workhouse was not a prison. Legally, you could give notice and walk out of the gate any morning you liked. Almost nobody did, because outside the gate was the thing the law had worked so carefully to make it worse than, and it turned out that bar was very, very low. The last of these buildings did not close until the 20th century was well underway. Some of them are hospitals now. People are born in them.